Death was never a mystery you could avoid. It was a neighbor. You live in a world where death is mostly hidden. It happens in hospitals, behind curtains, announced later by a phone call. You can go years without seeing a body. For most of human history, that was unthinkable. Your ancestors watched people die constantly and almost never knew why. A fever would take a child in a matter of days. A wound that seemed minor would turn dark and swollen and then fatal. A woman in labor might simply not survive the night. There was no germ theory, no antibiotics, no diagnosis to hand the grief a name. Death simply arrived, took someone, and left the living to make sense of it with nothing but ritual, story, and each other. So what do you do with a loss you cannot explain, cannot predict, and cannot prevent? By the end of this, you'll understand why so many of the rituals, beliefs, and even quiet mental habits you carry around death did not come from religion or culture alone. They came from something older. They came from thousands of generations of humans trying to survive the psychological weight of constant, unexplained loss. Paleodemographers, researchers who study how populations lived and died in the past, have pieced together a rough picture of ancestral mortality from skeletal remains, small-scale societies, and historical records. The picture is stark. In many pre-industrial and small-scale societies, roughly a third to a half of children didn't survive to adulthood, and adult death could arrive suddenly, from infection, childbirth, or injury, at almost any age. This isn't a precise universal number, and it varied enormously by time, place, and circumstance, but the pattern holds across very different populations. Death was not a distant event scheduled for old age. It was a constant possibility woven into every ordinary day, and your ancestors did something remarkable in response. They didn't just grieve. They built systems. Picture a group gathered in the mouth of a cave, firelight moving across stone walls, a body laid carefully on its side, knees drawn up, as if resting rather than gone. Someone places a hand tool beside it. Someone else scatters a handful of ochre, a red pigment, across the chest. No one in that circle has a word for bacteria or blood loss. What they have is each other, and a set of actions that turn an incomprehensible absence into something they can do together. This is not imagination. Archaeologists studying the origins of deliberate burial, including work by Paul Pettit at Durham University, have traced how early humans began treating the dead with intention rather than simply leaving bodies where they fell. Even further back, at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found Neanderthal remains arranged in ways that suggested careful placement. For years, popular accounts described this as a flower burial, the dead surrounded by blooms. More recent analysis, including work by Emma Pomeroy at the University of Cambridge, has complicated that story. The pollen found near the remains may have come from burrowing insects or rodents rather than deliberate floral tributes. Whether it was ritual or something more practical is still debated among archaeologists. What isn't in question is that something changed deep in our evolutionary past when hominins began treating a body differently after death than before it. Here is the unexpected part. You might assume that grief itself is simply an emotional reaction, something that happens to you without any deeper function. But researchers in evolutionary psychology, including John Archer in his work on the nature of grief, have argued that grief behaves like an evolved attachment response. Its intensity roughly tracks the strength of the relationship that was lost. It disrupts eating, sleeping, and focus in ways that look almost designed. From a survival standpoint, an animal that formed no bonds would suffer no loss when a companion died. But humans are radically dependent on cooperation to survive, so the same wiring that made you form deep attachments in the first place makes losing those attachments feel unbearable. Grief, in other words, may be the tax you pay for being a species that needs each other to stay alive. There's a second layer underneath this, one that goes beyond any single loss. Psychologist Ernest Becker argued, in his influential work on the denial of death, that human beings are unusual among animals in one specific way. You know, with total certainty, that you will die, and you know it long before it happens. That awareness, Becker suggested, is almost too heavy to carry directly. So cultures build elaborate systems, religion, legacy, tradition, meaning, to manage it. Decades later, psychologists tested this idea directly in a body of research known as terror management theory, developed by Sheldon Solomon, Jeffrey Greenberg, and Tom Pichichinsky. In experiments, simply reminding people of their own mortality measurably shifted their behavior, often making them cling more tightly to their group's beliefs and values. Most of this research began with participants in Western societies, so it shouldn't be treated as a universal law of every culture. But the underlying pattern, that mortality awareness quietly steers belief and behavior, has now shown up across a wide range of studies. Think of it like this. A ship's crew that knows a storm is somewhere out there, always, at some unknown point on the horizon, doesn't spend every hour panicking about it. They build routines. They check the same ropes each morning. They tell the same stories at night. The ritual isn't really about the storm. It's about staying steady while the storm remains possible. Ancient burial customs, mourning rites, ancestor stories, and even simple gestures like visiting a grave function the same way. They are not just ways of saying goodbye. They are how a mind that knows death is coming keeps functioning anyway. This is where it gets counterintuitive. You might expect that as medicine advanced and death became rarer and more predictable, humans would feel less anxious about it, not more. In some ways, the opposite happened. When death was common and visible, communities had constant practice processing it together, openly, with shared ritual. Now that death is comparatively rare and often hidden away in institutions, many people encounter it for the first time as adults, with almost no lived practice and far fewer communal structures to hold the weight of it. The ancient world had more death. In some ways, it may have been better equipped to carry it. You can probably feel an echo of this in your own life, even now. The instinct to say something at a funeral, even when words feel useless. The pull to visit a grave on an anniversary, as if presence still matters. The way loss doesn't just hurt, it disorganizes you, makes ordinary tasks feel strange, exactly the pattern researchers describe as an attachment system responding to something it cannot fix. None of that is a flaw in you. It's an old, well-used system, built across a very long history of loss, still doing the only job it knows how to do. Your ancestors could not explain why people died. They built rituals instead, not because they understood less than you do, but because they understood something you may have forgotten. That grief was never meant to be carried alone, and it never needed an explanation to be honored. Death was never a mystery you could avoid. It was a neighbor, and the ways you've learned to sit with that neighbor were passed down to you by people who had far more practice than you ever will.